Hello, I'm Courtney Lewis, Regional Planner with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Thank you for viewing this virtual presentation and feedback session. We have been working with the Town of Saugus to complete a joint hazard mitigation and municipal vulnerability preparedness plan. The hazard mitigation plan focuses on preparing for all types of natural hazards, and the municipal vulnerability preparedness plan focuses on preparing for future climate impacts. We had planned to hold this session in person, but the need for social distancing has moved us online. One benefit of this virtual session is perhaps the opportunity for more people to be able to participate from home at a time that better accommodates their schedule. We hope you will take a moment and review the content because the success of this plan depends on community feedback. I hope that you, your family, and loved ones are safe and well, and I look forward to future opportunities to meet in person. Thank you for your participation and have a great day. This is the agenda for the presentation. I'll first provide background on the two separate elements of the plan. Then I will review the latest data on climate observations and projections, and then focus on local impacts in Saugus. Next, I'll summarize the results of the workshop held in January that identified Saugus's climate vulnerabilities, strengths, and future priorities. Finally, I'll provide information on how you can share your questions, observations, and priorities. First, I want to acknowledge the leadership of the project team. As you can see, we have participation across many of the town's departments. Under the leadership of the town planner, Alex Mello, and Jeannie Meredith, the team planned the January workshop and is in the process of developing the hazard mitigation plan. The core team has been working hard to assure the success of this plan. This slide gives a quick overview of the two plan elements. Hazard mitigation planning is overseen by FEMA and focuses on natural hazards. The left column lists all the hazards we will be addressing as part of the hazard mitigation plan. Hazard mitigation plans focus on natural, weather-driven occurrences, not terrorism or chemical spills, for example. It is also not an emergency response plan. The focus is on taking preventative steps to address natural hazards. The Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness, or MVP program, is sponsored by the state and focuses on climate-related hazards. As it turns out, earthquakes are the only natural hazards that are not projected to be impacted by climate change. As you will see, the MVP program is organized around considering impacts to the environment, infrastructure, and society. In the next few slides, I will provide a brief background on each program. We are essentially capitalizing on the synergies of the HMP and the MVP program to efficiently produce one plan that satisfies the requirements of both programs. The Federal Disaster Mitigation Act was passed in the year 2000. The act set a goal for all municipalities across the country to have a hazard mitigation plan. Compliance with the goal is not a requirement. However, in order to be eligible for FEMA mitigation grants, towns must have a hazard mitigation plan. The impetus for these plans was that across the country, FEMA was seeing this cycle of disaster, rebuilding, and then the same disaster, damage, and rebuilding again. The goal of these plans is to interrupt this cycle. Obviously, disaster events are costly to taxpayers and to private citizens, and often involve a lot of human suffering. So we want to analyze our vulnerabilities and address them before the next disaster. This slide illustrates the planning process. The town team has pretty much completed the first four steps of updating hazards and facilities. This presentation is designed to update you on our work and to get your suggestions for the mitigation strategies that will be developed in step 6. One of the tasks of the core team was to identify critical infrastructure, known flooding areas, fire risks, and anticipated future development locations. We put all that information together to assess potential risks, and we will look more closely at a map of Saugus in an upcoming slide. This is a partial list of mitigation measures that existed before the first plan was developed. I certainly won't try to read them all, but I just wanted to show that the town has been addressing natural hazards long before these planning processes started. Strategies range from enforcing regulations to ongoing maintenance to land protection and public education. Many of the mitigation efforts are really woven into the daily tasks of town departments, such as DPW. In the next steps, the core team will draft new mitigation strategies. We will hold an additional public meeting to allow for review of the final draft plan and then place it on the town's website. The plan then goes through a somewhat lengthy review process with MEMA and FEMA. And when finally adopted, the town will be eligible to apply for grants to implement the mitigation measures. Turning now to the MVP program, in September 2016, Governor Baker signed Executive Order 569, instructing state government to provide assistance to cities and towns to complete climate vulnerability assessments and resiliency action plans. This led to the launch of the MVP program. Saugus applied for and received a grant to become a certified MVP community. The certification requires a one-day workshop and this public feedback session. As part of the MVP program, we produced a report that summarizes the workshop. I will share the link of the draft report at the end of this presentation. The final report will incorporate your feedback, and much like the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Program, the town will be eligible for implementation grants when it completes this project. In January, we held a one-day workshop. Town staff, leadership, and representatives of community organizations spent a day reviewing climate hazards, considering the town's strengths and vulnerabilities, and developing proposals to address them. These were our goals at the workshop. We have the same goals for this presentation today. We want to get your feedback about priorities and anything you would add to what was identified at the workshop. Each of you brings your expertise and your knowledge of conditions in Saugus. This is an opportunity to shape the town's future and ensure that it remains a strong and vibrant community. Next, I will review the climate information presented at the workshop. I do want to acknowledge that we may not all have the same view of climate change, what may happen in the future, and its causes. The most recent climate projections provided by the state indicate that extreme weather events will become more frequent and more severe. The following slides will provide those projections, but I respect that each of us has our own perspectives that inform our thoughts on the need to take action. In any case, Saugus has experienced extreme weather in the past, and we know extreme events will happen again in the future. So I think we can all agree on the need to be prepared. This slide provides a snapshot of the concept of climate warming. Solar energy comes in from the sun and some heat is radiated back to space, but some is trapped by gases in the atmosphere that functions like a blanket holding heat in. This is what keeps the planet's temperature regulated. Without these gases, the planet would be too cold to support life. Industrialization has meant a tremendous increase in the concentration of gases in the atmosphere because of the combustion of fossil fuels. Typically, people refer to these gases as greenhouse gases, and generally, we talk more about CO2 because it is the most abundant of those gases. This chart shows the increase in CO2 starting in 1880. This comes from actual measurements taken from an observatory in Hawaii. The slide also shows how temperatures have been increasing with CO2 concentrations. The next few slides look at changes that have already occurred and changes projected for the future. The first impact, and the one that fuels others, is an increase in temperature. This slide shows temperatures recorded at the Blue Hill Observatory in Milton. It shows an increase of nearly 3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1831. For those of you interested in local climate data, the Blue Hill Observatory is a valuable resource, and you can find weather records on their website. Projections, by their nature, are neither observed nor documented, so you will always see a range of projections because of the inherent uncertainty in predicting the future. Two basic sources of uncertainty are that one, scientists model impacts, and depending on their level of confidence in the model, the range will be larger or smaller. And two, we don't know what future greenhouse gas emissions will be. Most models provide a projection of a lower and higher emission scenario. You can see that in this graphic. These are projections from the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center at UMass Amherst. Lower predictions assume more success in reducing greenhouse gases, while high predictions assume higher future greenhouse gases. You can see that in both scenarios. There's the potential for many more days over 90 degrees before the end of the century. The graphic to the right shows that by the end of the century, temperatures in the state could be similar to temperatures in Maryland or South Carolina, depending on the scenario. We have already seen a steady increase in annual precipitation in the Boston area over the past 50 years. We have also seen a significant increase in the size of our largest rainfall events across the Northeast US. There is less scientific certainty in rainfall projections, but agreement on the trend: more rain annually and larger rain events generally, and also a shift to more rain in the winter and early spring and slightly less in the summer and fall. This slide shows projections for the 10-year 24-hour storm, a figure typically used for stormwater calculations. You can see that it has gone up from 1961 to 2014. These future rainfall projections were done for the city of Cambridge. Even though more rain is projected, it is also true that more frequent summer and fall droughts are predicted. This is due to a combination of earlier snowmelt, slightly less rain in the summer and fall, and warmer temperatures that will increase evaporation. This map shows conditions throughout the state during the drought of 2016. This map is from the Resilient MA website. It shows a projected increase in the consecutive number of dry days by 2050. This slide shows sea level rise to date as recorded at the Boston Harbor Tide Station in downtown Boston. It amounts to nearly a foot in the last century. This slide shows projected future sea level rise. You can see the range of projections varies significantly, especially later in the century. The two big sources of uncertainty are future greenhouse gas emissions and the extent of melting of land-based glaciers. This map of Saugus identifies critical infrastructure, flood, fire potential, and high heat areas. The small green dots are critical infrastructure. This covers a broad range of facilities, including town buildings, schools, senior facilities, dams, wells, utilities, locations where hazardous materials are stored, needed services like pharmacies and grocery stores, and places where people might gather, like churches. Flooding is represented by FEMA flood zones, but also locations in dark blue where flooding has occurred in the past. The pink dots represent floodplain locations from March 2010. They are enlarged to comply with federal privacy requirements. You may remember that eastern Massachusetts had severe flooding in March 2010. The Blue Hill Observatory recorded over 18 inches of rain in 17 days. The flooding led to a federal disaster declaration. We consider the March 2010 flooding to be an example of the type of flooding predicted to occur more frequently as the climate warms. That is, extreme rainfall amounts falling in the winter as rain rather than snow on frozen ground and while vegetation is still dormant. Brush fire locations are highlighted in orange. These represent more thickly wooded areas where the potential for brush fires exists. Finally, the pink hatched areas represent heat islands, identified as hotspots on the map. Remote sensing was used to record land temperatures on a cloudless day where temperatures were over 90 degrees. The pink hatched areas represent the hottest 5% of land temperatures in the 101 communities of Greater Boston represented by MAPC. Generally, your hotter areas will have a greater concentration of pavements and buildings, and you can see that commercial areas along Route 1 represent most of the hot spots in Saugus. Of course, when it's hot out, it will be hot everywhere. Access to air conditioning can become a key issue during heat waves. Next, we look at societal issues. Just as some locations in Saugus will be more vulnerable to climate change impacts than others, it is also the case that some residents will be more vulnerable than others. Social vulnerability refers to social, economic, demographic, or health factors that make groups of people less resilient to climate change impacts. This is similar to what we are seeing today with the coronavirus, where age, health status, employment, and other socioeconomic characteristics impact vulnerability. People who may be more susceptible to negative health effects can include older adults, younger children, pregnant women, people with disabilities, and people with pre existing health conditions, as they are more likely to be physically vulnerable to the health impacts of extreme heat and poor air quality. Individuals with physical mobility constraints may need additional assistance with emergency response. People who may have more difficulty adapting to, preparing for, or recovering from extreme weather events refers to socioeconomic characteristics such as income and race that can influence vulnerability to climate change. Low income individuals are more vulnerable to financial shocks, which can occur after extreme weather and impact financial security. It could also affect the ability to secure safe shelter and meet medical needs. Social isolation can also influence vulnerability as it limits access to critical information, municipal resources, and social support systems. People most at risk for social isolation include those living alone and people with limited English language proficiency. People who live or work in vulnerable locations include historic and future flood locations, areas prone to wildfires, heat islands, and neighborhoods prone to power outages. Vulnerable workers can include first responders, landscapers, construction workers, and those who work in hot indoor environments. MAPC projects that the number of children under age 5 will remain steady, while adults over age 65 will grow to approximately 25% of the population by 2030. People living alone account for 22% of Saugus's population, and almost half of that group is 65 years of age or older. Nearly 9% of residents in Saugus are below the poverty level, and 37.7% are considered low income households. A disproportionate percentage of older adults are low income. Prolonged heat can exacerbate illnesses such as asthma. Black and Latino residents are hospitalized for asthma at considerably higher rates than the population as a whole, demonstrating how underlying socioeconomic conditions can lead to differential impacts based on race and ethnicity. Saugus has become more diverse in recent decades. Census data indicates the trend is continuing, with people of color accounting for 10% of the population. The next few slides focus on the natural environment. Natural resources will be impacted and can have impacts on future climate change. On the positive side, natural resources lessen climate impacts by absorbing and storing carbon dioxide and by serving vital protective functions. Forests, open space, wetlands, rivers, and streams protect drinking water quality and quantity, provide flood control, and give relief from extreme heat. Healthy ecosystems are more resistant to stresses from a changing climate and better able to protect against heat and flooding. Trees are important in mitigating the impact of heat waves. According to the EPA, suburban areas with mature trees are 4 to 6 degrees cooler than new suburbs without trees. Shaded surfaces can be 25 to 40 degrees cooler than the peak temperatures of unshaded surfaces. Trees also absorb remarkable quantities of precipitation. Research has shown that a typical medium-sized tree can, can intercept as much as 2,300 gallons of rainwater per year. Trees are also Trees also create vulnerabilities as fallen limbs and trees can cause power outages, block streets, and cause injuries and damage. Trees may be susceptible to new pests and diseases. They may also be weakened by flooding and drought. Over time, warming temperatures will change the mix of trees best adapted to our region. You can see that tree cover is greater in the less densely developed areas of Saugus. The state identifies areas they call core habitat and critical natural landscapes. These are intact landscapes or exemplary natural communities that are better able to withstand climate stresses and support the long-term survival of rare species and natural habitats. They include areas along the Saugus River, Breakheart Reservation, Rumney Marsh Reservation, and the Lynn Woods. The Conservation Department notes that the undeveloped lands provide flood storage and flood damage protection, water quality protection, groundwater recharge, wildlife habitat, and educational values. Finally, rare species habitats identifies the known habitat areas for state protected rare plant and animal species. Drought can have severe negative impacts on water quality and quantity. Low flow in rivers and streams affects aquatic habitat and can cause algal blooms and low dissolved oxygen. Flooding can wash pollutants into local waters, cause overflows, and erode stream banks. Saugus has numerous wetlands, streams, and water bodies. The town's wetland systems protect water quality and quantity, provide flood control, and maintain overall ecosystem health for climate resilience. At the MVP workshop, participants reviewed the same information you have just seen. They identified Saugus's climate strengths and vulnerabilities in the areas of infrastructure, society, and environment. Then they proposed solutions for each vulnerability and went through a process of picking top priorities. This is the list of the highest priorities. Thank you for listening to this presentation. When you close out this slideshow, you will see two additional links on the web page. The first will take you to the draft MVP report. Please review the report for more detailed summary of Saugus's climate strengths, vulnerabilities, and action items. This presentation included their top priorities, but there were many additional worthy suggestions that may interest you. After you have a chance to review the report, please go to the final link which will take you to a short survey where you can add your thoughts and priorities. The feedback we receive from you will be included in the final version of the MVP report. Thanks again for your participation.